McFarlane, welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. I've got a special guest today, a friend and colleague, a partner in the black press industry. Stacey is the host of Let It Be Known, a show that airs every morning, 6:30 Minneapolis time, 7:30 East Coast time. It's the daily news show, news briefing and roundup interview show. Perfect, excellent way to begin your day. Produced by Stacy and the team at the National Newspaper Publishers Association, distributed online through YouTube and Facebook Live, Black Press USA Facebook Live. Stacy, good afternoon. How you doing, man?
Doing good, Al. How are you?
I'm doing well. Let me introduce you to another colleague and friend, Yusuf Mjini, and I have been sort of tied at the hip for a gazillion years. Yusuf was one of, along with me, the founders of the Twin Cities Black Communications Group a generation ago, and has been a stellar organizer, broadcaster, leader in community for a number of years. Also here, Dr. Irma McLaurin, the culture and education editor for Insight News. Irma, good to see you. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Thank you for joining. Well, before I ask Yusuf and Irma to jump in, I want to take a minute, Stacey, to have you talk about the valuable work that you do, that we do as members of National Newspaper Publishers Association, and what you're doing in social media. It's innovative. It's amazing. I watched part of the program you had yesterday, I think, where you had two of our reporters coming back from Sudan.
Right.
Great stuff.
Yeah, the NNPA's executive administrator, Claudia Perry, put that together along with the ambassador, Erica Bennett. What a news story that is coming out of Sudan. But, you know, we've been at this, Al, as you know, for a while now. This is where journalism is, right? We have to do more than just the print edition. So thanks to Claudia Perry and Dr. Chavis, of course, and our chair, Karen Carter-Richards, and of course, the producer of Let It Be Known, Greer Marshall, we are able to bring insight from a Black perspective every single morning, Monday through Friday, 7:30 Eastern. And we are so fortunate that we have publishers in the NNPA like yourself and others who really make that program what it is, and that is that we are able to give the Black press viewers and listeners and readers more news and information than they've ever gotten in the past. So we're grateful for that platform.
Well, today is special because I got the notice a few minutes ago that the verdict in the case of the charges against former police officer of Brooklyn Center, Kim Potter, in the death of Dante Wright, will be read at 1:30, and I hope that we'll be able to break into this conversation and share that verdict being read and talk about it. But I wanted today to actually begin by setting that stage. We're also joined by my colleague here in Twin Cities, Tom Gata. Tom, good afternoon. Good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Al. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, Tom, why don't I ask you to set the stage about what we are expecting to happen one way or the other at 1:30. Did you get the notice from the state too about the verdict being read today?
No, I haven't. Did they send something out?
They did. We just received notice from the AG's office. We posted it on our Facebook page that the jury will be delivering its verdict at 1:30. So we intend to break into this show and live stream that verdict. We've been live streaming the trial from its inception and getting a lot of response. So we'll keep doing that. But you're close to the Brooklyn Center community, and put in context how the situation looks on the ground and in the community's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as all of you know, this is it's probably going to be one of the longest deliberations in our state history, actually, as far as, jury deliberation that concerns a police officer. I think this is probably right now is the longest they have taken, because they were sequestered on Monday afternoon, and this is a Thursday afternoon that they're getting done. And also, the thing was, the judge had already indicated that if they don't reach a verdict by today, basically was going to give them Friday off and the weekend for Christmas off, and then come back on Monday, which I kind of also, if you remember, you and I had a conversation, I think yesterday, that I just didn't expect that to happen, that they'll go back, or they'll go home after being sequestered and then come back. So I think that probably speeded things up a little bit, I think. So, I mean, people are kind of on edge, really, to be honest with you. I mean, anybody I've talked to in Brooklyn Center, they're just sort of concerned of how long this has taken to begin with, in terms of the deliberations I just talked about. And then also there's also, what the verdict is going to be. We don't know. So that, everybody I've talked to is very, very concerned, at least, the regular folk, that is. I don't know about the officials,
Sure.
elected officers. They've been kind of, saying they're prepared for any eventuality, but I'm pretty sure they're also very concerned.
Take a minute, Tom, if you would, and give people who might not be familiar with the demographics of Brooklyn Center. It's a very unique and special community here in Minnesota. People around the country know Minneapolis and St. Paul, but they don't have an idea of what's happening in the suburban communities. In Brooklyn Center in particular, and Brooklyn Park, its neighbor, have a unique position as the expanding of Black and Brown residents grow in those communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's in our state here, it's actually the most diverse. It's a fostering suburb to Minneapolis, so right next door. It's to Minneapolis. Population just over 30,000. More than half, maybe close to 60%, but for sure more than half of the residents there are people of color, which is a mixture of African Americans, Hmong community, African immigrant. So it's quite a melting pot of sorts, and quite unique, especially for a suburb. And then also the mayor, Mike Elliott, just is serving his first term. Is his first term? Yeah. He was the first Black mayor for that city. So it's quite a representative city, I'll say, very mixed, and it's quite tragic, obviously, what happened, and it really shook up the city. As you know, there was a lot of what's the word? What's the correct way to say? I mean, there was just a lot of disturbances. People were upset. The National Guard had to come out, which was quite an ugly scene, as you know. So it was ugly. It was ugly.
Tom, the population is about 60% people of color, but isn't the population within the school district closer to 80% students of color?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think what has happened in the Brooklyn Center is that for the whites that have remained behind, they tend to be more of an older population. Okay, so possibly maybe they don't have school-age children. A lot of them, for sure, at least on the elementary level, there are very few white students, for example. Okay, so that's why the 80%. High school is a little bit kind of, not as quite at 80%, but the elementary and below is pretty much, as you said, Yusuf, 80% people of color, and predominantly actually Black people, to put it bluntly.
A standard metropolitan statistical area is all of the adjoining counties that have a population of 50,000 or more. And for decades, the Twin Cities was a 7-county metropolitan area. It's now an 11-county metropolitan area that stretches 40 miles west into 40 miles east into western Wisconsin, and contains almost 3 million people. So it's become a significant metropolitan area. But we have the highest poverty rate of the 25 largest American cities here in Minneapolis and St. Paul at about 43.7%. So it's a tale of two cities. It's the land of milk and honey, of Humphrey, Mondale, Franken, etc. But at the same time, We have the lowest home ownership rates for African Americans in the United States, and we have the highest achievement gap between Black students and middle-class white students. So it's a land of plenty for some and a land of none for plenty.
Stacey Brown, jump in if you would, and talk about both the perception nationally of our marketplace of Minneapolis and St. Paul, keeping in mind, this is where Ilhan Omar is from, where Keith Ellison is the Attorney General, and where those luminaries, Walter Mondale, Al Franken, Hewitt Humphrey, all built their careers and their names. And at the same time, the demographics that Youssef just shared really tell the story for our Black and brown population. How does that play? And how does that play into what the country is thinking as it's waiting to hear this verdict on the adjudication of Kim Potter in the death of Dante Wright? And that, with the background of what we experienced last year with George Floyd as well. What do you think, Stacey?
Yes. So from a national standpoint, it does seem that obviously this is a lot less volatile than the situation with Derek Chauvin and his trial, but still not less important. I think one of the biggest things that folks from the outside see in Minneapolis and Minnesota, you see Keith Ellison, as you mentioned, taking the helm there as the Attorney General. Keith is very respected around the country, and of course, being an African American, former member of the Congressional Black Caucus, he is, I think he alone, just his reputation really has helped with this situation. George Floyd, and then piggybacking the George Floyd situation, obviously you have the Dante Wright, and which is what we're waiting for this verdict now for Kim Potter. So I think the outside perception of Minnesota and as a state has been shaped rather fairly or unfairly by these three things: the George Floyd situation, Kim Potter situation, and of course having Keith Ellison really step up. We have not seen attorney generals step up the way Keith Ellison has stepped up in Minnesota. So I think that is a big plus for the city there, the Twin Cities there, and for the state as a whole.
I should also point out that although he's a native of Detroit, Keith was the first Muslim congressman and also the first Muslim attorney general in the United States, unapologetically.
Yeah, and then also, the two cases actually that his office has taken the lead to prosecute, that was actually due to community pressure, just FYI, because originally they were going to be tried by a county attorney, but the pressure from the community, forced the governor to direct Keith Ellison's office to take over the Derek Chauvin case.
And isn't that the role? Isn't that what citizens should do, Al and Tom? That's what they should do, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, because the history of a lot of these county attorneys hasn't been great when it comes to people of color, trying cases, especially police cases, and the community was pretty skeptical that they'll be able to prosecute the case. And actually, in the case of the one that we're waiting for now, Dante's case, that one, of course, they gave it to a neighboring, to another county attorney to prosecute. But the charges that that county attorney was trying to bring against Kim Potter is what really annoyed a lot of in the community, and the state was forced to step in again.
Irma, talk about this question of perception of Minnesota. You were critical in creating a new space for education and community development here in North Minneapolis in particular, but you came in as an educator to a role of vice president and to create the Center for Urban and Regional Research and Outreach and Engagement. I think that's, you tell me the proper name, but it's what we call UROC here in North Minneapolis. But it wasn't easy. And the question I'm asking is a question of, from your experience, the assessment of the cultural dynamic, the environment here. On the one hand, there's reputation that is created by the luminaries I mentioned, but then there's the reality that Youssef talked about, where the disparities reek to high heaven in terms of the quality of life for Black people. What about that from your point of view as an educator?
I think there are a number of aspects of Minneapolis that most people don't really recognize. It is perceived as sort of a white bread, state. It has one of the highest, I believe, incidence of wealthy whites. A lot of these great Target and Best Buy and a lot of these things were founded in Minneapolis. So there's tremendous wealth there. Its history has been shaped by this notion of Scandinavians coming in. But what's interesting about Minneapolis is that it has a historic Black community, and I'm not talking about contemporary, that it was on the path to Canada, and Blacks actually stopped in Minneapolis. So it's got a Black presence that goes back to before Minnesota was a state, okay, when it was just a territory. And most people don't know that. It also has a huge indigenous population that is almost invisible. We never hear discussions about what is happening. It's an impoverished community, but it's about 10 to 12% of the state. And yet we don't hear much about that community. It also is interesting. And let me just say, when I came in to take over the role of founding executive director of the first Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center, which was to build a university research center by refurbishing a derelict shopping center into a university research center in the Black community, that at that moment was the most underserved North Minneapolis, which is, of course, where your newspaper is located.
Mhm.
It also was a place when I got there where 52% of all the mortgage foreclosures that were happening at that moment in 2008 were occurring in the 5 zip codes that constituted North Minneapolis. 52% of the mortgage foreclosures in the entire state, in Minneapolis, were happening in these zip codes where Black people were concentrated. And this was not the first time that the community had been sort of, in many ways, economically and socially assaulted, right? With no support. There was no industry. So UROC was sort of like trying to say, how can we bring the resources of the university into the community at a moment when they also lacked trust in the community being, an honest broker and a good neighbor. So you have that. The other thing about Minneapolis, and I've been coming to it since 1973, I have family there, so I feel like I've seen it grow and develop over time, is that you had this influx, particularly of Black men from Chicago and other areas to come and do jobs in that area, professional Black men. And you also have this burgeoning biracial population. And I remember thinking, as someone who has a colleague who studies white women who have birthed children who are defined by the state as Black and who may self-identify as such. She was looking at this in the UK, and I thought, gee, if you ever want to do that study in the United States, Minneapolis might be a very interesting place to come to because it has this population. And then you have this influx, this tremendous influx of these immigrant communities. You have the largest population of Somalians outside of Somalia live in Minneapolis. You have a Liberian population of people who've been given, I believe, asylum status because of what's happening in Liberia. That's the largest group of Liberians outside of Liberia in one area. So you've got like this mixture of indigenous and immigrant and native, and African Americans that come more recently, and then those who are historic. And none of that is really talked about when we talk about the history of Minneapolis. So one of the things is that the historical origins of people, who they are and how they got there, is very much invisible. It's not taught in the schools. And so people look at everybody with one broad stroke. So when we say Black, everybody's consumed under that. We never talk about Indigenous. You know, there's sort of the invisible community, and yet they're there. And so I think more has to be done in terms of forefronting what is Minneapolis at this point, Minneapolis and St. Paul, because St. Paul has also a historic Black community as well. And so we talk about them as if they're twin cities, but they're very discrete. They're separated. And we really don't talk about sort of the history that has shaped Minneapolis to be where it is, and that needs to account for why there's such tremendous disparity. I remember hearing from people that Minneapolis applied to be one of those Harlem school zones and was turned down because it was the granting body thought, you have tremendous wealth, but it's not trickling down, you know? So you have the capacity to not have an achievement gap, to not have an education gap, to not have an employment gap, but it's not happening. And so the question is, what are the barriers? You know, why is that the case?
Yusuf, you're a native, I believe. You've been here for a generation or two. And at that context of this conversation, this is a unique community. I'll say that the first story I did when I began my career in journalism here, I was a student at the University of Minnesota and an editor of Random magazine, the college publication. And I had a chance to interview Nat Eubanks. Nat Eubanks was the quote unquote classic Black Panther leader organizer, had a property on Plymouth and Penn where UROC is now, or next door to it, Dr. Irma. And he and the Revolutionary Brothers used to be holed up with their rifles, creating their movement space, and also tried to create a grocery store. But I asked him about how he came to Minnesota from St. Louis. And an interesting part of the story that I published is that they had driven for so long in what he called the white land coming out of St. Louis, and finally pulled onto Hennepin Avenue, downtown Main Street, and saw another Black man, jumped out of the car so happy and said, "Hey, you know, Black man, brother, how you doing?" And brother said, "Hey, you know, we all from St. Louis. Well, welcome to Minnesota. This is really the best place in the world.
Wow.
You can get any white woman you want."
Oh gosh.
Those are the first words he heard from the first Black person he met. And so the standard for freedom was the ability to have sex with white women. And so talk about this whole dynamic of our community and our numbers over the generations, Yusuf and Jeannie.
Well, first, thank you, Al. Let me say that St. Paul and Minneapolis are considered twin cities, with the population in Minneapolis being twice that of St. Paul. But the definition that Dr. McFarlane just shared is in reality that Minneapolis and St. Paul are a reflection of one another. Mm-hmm. One somewhat larger than the other, but the social qualities of life and criteria are essentially the same. There's not a great deal of difference between the two cities. My forebears homesteaded on University Avenue back in the 1850s, before, as Dr. McFarlane mentioned, statehood existed within the state of Minnesota. And the strange irony, Al, is that the first thing, and frequently the only thing, that white children are taught about the Black community is how to stay out of it. Mm-hmm. And because of the repeated urgency of, no matter how bad things get, you'll always be better than a quote, a Black person.
That's right.
And, I don't want to catch you with the Black person. Made a lot of young white women want to get one of them. Okay. And a lot of brothers used to run around the University of Minnesota campus, and they would stop white women and say, "Pardon me, miss, do you have any colored in you?" And they would say, "Tee-hee." "Why, no, why?" And they would say, "Would you like a little?" And that was essentially the mating process here, that white women were very open to relationships and the advancement of such with their brown brothers. And today, we're seeing more Caucasian men soliciting relationships with African-American women. So there was a sense of permissiveness that existed in this community that was far more welcoming and attractive than it was in other major metropolitan areas where interracial relationships were frowned on. That extended so much that the majority of the Korean people in the state of Minnesota were adopted by white people, almost as though they were pets. And so there was this fascination with people who were not Caucasian on the one hand. At the same time, there were these disparaging and dehumanizing obstacles to any semblance of full participation politically, economically, culturally. Yet socially was the one instance where, whether it was with the Jewish community, which is also white, or with the Scandinavian community, with communities who had trouble with their we's and their w's, there was almost instant access for young African-American men. The other historical cornerstone of that relationship is that most of the people who escaped slavery and made this the last stop on the Underground Railroad traveled with young males, African-American males. So there was a shortage of African-American females in the Twin Cities. And Van White, who was the second Black elected official citywide in the city of Minneapolis after Nellie Stone Johnson, who was the first Black elected official back in the 1930s, said that when his African-American sister turned 12 years old, there was a line of men at the back door in North Minneapolis, Black men, asking if they could have her hand in marriage, because there was a real shortage of African-American females of marrying motherhood age. And nationally, Black people are 40% Native American because of the early intermarriage of slaves with Indian women. And in Minnesota, the population, a lot of the families here who are light complexion have a lot of Indian relationships. The first African-American person of record in the state of Minnesota was Jean Bunga, okay?
Yeah.
And his Indian descendants used the last name Bungo, and the African-American descendants, that side of the family, used the name Bunga, okay? So it was with Indians, it was with white women, it was with whatever females happened to be available and interested. And it has spread from Black and white to Black and Indian, Black and Mexican, Black and Jewish, just across the spectrum. So there's a great deal more interracial relationships and interracial marriages and children here than there are in many parts of the country. I think second to New Orleans and some aspects of the South.
A lot of that is covered in a TPT, a Twin Cities Public Television documentary called North Star. Irma, talk about that for a second, if you would. And let's say we're waiting to the hoping to hear the verdict, maybe able to carry the verdict if we can get the live stream. That should be happening in a couple of minutes. The verdict in the trial of Kim Potter for the death of Dante Wright. So if we're able to get that feed, we're going to bring that live and we'll watch that from the side here. Irma, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to mention North Star because this is a twin TPT documentary because it traces the history. It talks about Bongo, but it really gives a sense of how long the Black presence has been in this territory, then becomes state. And it sort of defies this contemporary idea that Black people just got to Minneapolis or to Minnesota, recently. The other way in which Blacks came to be inserted into rural Minneapolis was through the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. They would stop on the trains, and some were experienced Minnesota nice and then came back, later and settled. So we've got all these waves. And I want to speak to Yusef's point about the gendered nature of these relationships, because at the moment in probably the 70s, when Black professional men were coming to Minneapolis, because there were not the opportunities, at least where I grew up in Chicago, and I left when I was 17, because I knew that I could not be all that I wanted to be if I stayed in Chicago. So I left and I went to Iowa. This is I'm a sort of a civil rights beneficiary. In 1969, white institutions were just beginning to open their doors. And the same was happening professionally. But again, it was gendered because women were not being given the same access and opportunities. So professional men or Black men were probably meeting professional white women in addition to all the other stuff. And so we have this way in which who we are today has been shaped by all these dimensions that don't get discussed. And one of the things that I am very concerned about, and part of why I am such an advocate for the archive that I'm developing, is that we have to have repositories of where this information is. If it's not going to be available in the schools, then we may have to go back to the 1960s Black Panther notion of having weekend schools. We know that Asian communities do it. I have a friend, her children are going to Jewish school, so we may have to go back to these Black schools in which we teach Black history and not be so reliant upon white institutions, which is what schools are. There's still, no matter that over 50% of the student population are students of color. In Minneapolis, it's going to be immigrant, indigenous, African American. But in most places nationally, 84%, according to the National Center on Education, 84% of all teachers in public schools and public charter schools are white.
Let's break away for the live verdict coverage. This is being streamed to our website, Insight News. Can you turn the volume up? Let's watch this and we'll talk about it. And I think we can still talk while we're watching this, if that's the case. Can you all hear me still?
Yes.
Okay, so we're able to talk as this
Miss Potter,
plays.
please rise.
Here we go.
Here we go.
I'm now going to read your verdicts as it will appear in the permanent court records of 10:30 a.m. on 12/21/21. Members of the jury, is this your true and correct verdict? So say you one, and so say you all.
Yes.
Okay, you may be seated. All right, I am now going to poll the jury. Juror number 2, is this your true and correct verdict?
So guilty on all counts.
Juror
We
number
missed that
6.
announcement there.
Is this your true and correct verdict?
Yeah, just polling the jury
Juror
now.
There we go.
number
There we
7,
go.
is this your
Yeah,
true and
kind of
correct
surprising.
verdict?
After
13.
they came back the other day
This is
and
your
asked
true and
about
correct verdict.
not being able to reach a verdict, it looked like this was headed toward a mistrial. But now we
It's
get
juror,
today guilty on
excuse
all
me,
counts.
Juror 11.
Youssef, surprised at all?
Juror 17.
Tom, surprised?
Is this
What are your
true
thoughts?
and correct verdict?
Absolutely.
No.
Um,
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised. Yeah.
Is this your true
and Stacy said, when they
Juror
asked
number
what would happen
21,
if they
is this
couldn't
your
reach a
true and
unanimous
correct
verdict, many people were concerned that
Juror number
it would be
22. Is
an
this your
acquittal
true
or
and
found
correct
not guilty.
verdict?
Mhm.
And
Number
it's
26.
interesting
Is
that
this
a
your
black
true and
man,
correct verdict?
Somali man,
Juror number
African American, who
48,
was
is this your
charged
true and correct
with
verdict?
accidentally killing a white woman, was
Juror
found
number
guilty.
48,
Now we have the
is this your
reverse. A
true and
white woman
correct verdict?
accused of accidentally killing a black man
And juror
was also
number
found guilty. We'll see what
55, is
happens
this your true
in
and correct
sentencing, and I
verdict?
think we have to reserve judgment until that takes place.
Mhm.
Tom, what do you think?
Members of the jury,
Yeah, I mean,
when we
you know,
first
when
came
that
into the
when
courtroom,
they were asking these questions
told you
to the
that
judge
jurors
to
are
clarify, you know, whether
heroes
if they
of
can't
our
reach a
judicial
verdict
system.
or you know, something
Well,
like, or how long they should
you
deliberate, you know,
are
we were obviously
heroes in
concerned
this
that
case.
you know, this is
You might
that
remember
it was
that
a hung
there was a
jury,
question on the
sort of, you know,
questionnaire
or
that
not
asked
guilty
whether
even.
you wanted to be
But
on this jury.
and then there was also some thinking maybe they just hang
Yes,
up on
no,
one of
or
the
maybe.
charges, not both of them.
A number of you
But
checked
to come
no or
in
not
on
sure,
guilty on both is,
and a few
I'm a bit surprised
three.
based on the questions
When
they
I
were asking
asked each of
previously.
you if you
The
would
jury,
be
that
willing
is.
to serve,
Irma,
if the
thoughts?
party selected
Well,
you
I mean, I
as a
think the
juror,
shock is that
you
there
all
has been
said
so much
yes.
about her
You said
emotionality,
yes,
white
even though
woman's
we were
tears,
in
and
a
this is
pandemic
something
with
that has
Omicron
those of us who've
spreading
worked
in
in
our
white spaces
community.
most of our lives
You
has
said
had. It's a
yes,
form of
even though you had
microaggression,
concerns about
where when
serving,
you talk to
given
white
the
women
nature
and
of
they
the
feel
case.
they get on the
You
defensive, they
said
suddenly break
yes,
down and
even though
cry,
you
and
knew you
suddenly
would be
everybody comes
sequestered
to their
during
assistance.
deliberations
Everybody.
and away from your
And you
loved
become the
ones.
outsider, you become
And you said
the
yes, even
problem.
though there
And
was a
so it's
chance that
surprising
this
that
case
her
could have
performance of
lasted
tears
past
and all of
Christmas.
that was not as
You were
persuasive
willing to
as we thought it might
sacrifice
be.
much
And
because you
it
believed
is
in our
surprising, given the questions that
justice
the jury
system.
was asking, that they were able to reach a
And then you
unanimous
went into
verdict.
deliberations.
Is there hope
Each of
for the
you
justice
brought with
system?
you your common sense,
It can go
individual
either way. We
perceptions,
saw
and life
Rittenhouse get off because he
experiences.
claimed self-defense,
In Wisconsin.
and then we see this issue. And so, it's still not clear that this justice system is on the right path.
But it does seem that way in Minneapolis and Minnesota anyway. I mean, we got Dr. Irma, two huge verdicts that could have gone the other way, especially given the climate. We think about the fact that after the George Floyd murder in May of 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement went global, and there was this new pressure for law enforcement, for prosecutors to get it right, whether it's a federal prosecutor or a local prosecutor. And we've seen that support for Black Lives Matter wane as the time has gone by. And so there was some cover. There was some cover in Georgia, right, with those men who killed Ahmaud Arbery, but it did not work. They were convicted as well. So we're seeing Derek Chauvin, police officer, finally paying for his crimes, not just against George Floyd. Remember, he also pleaded guilty on something similar that he did to a younger person a few years ago. And now you have Kim Potter, who, a case could have been made. Yeah, this was a mistake. I mean, her reaction initially, and if you want to, you want to go back to the what many call crocodile tears of Kyle Rittenhouse to Kim Potter's tears that some said was the same, crocodile tears. That jury could have easily said, you know what, it was an honest mistake. We can't punish her, but they stuck to the law. They looked at Daunte Wright as a human being, something that African Americans have not gotten from jurors and prosecutors in the past. And they said, you know what? She should have known better. 25 years, she's a trained 25-year veteran. She should have known better. Derek Chauvin, he got
27 years.
27 years. Chauvin, he did it before. This was no accident. So
and we don't know how
there
many
is hope.
times he had done it. Yeah. And I mean, all we have are two instances in which he was caught. But who knows how many times he's done this, and people just felt like there's no point in reporting it because nothing's going to happen. The fact that he was still there. But
he had 17 complaints of excessive force or police brutality, and only had 2 verbal reprimands. And number one, this is not a cause for celebration because nothing will bring back the life of Daunte Law. Right.
But you know what? Also, Yusef and Al and Tom and Dr. Irma. The other thing is these cell phone cameras, videos, right?
Absolutely.
It's really vital now to film everything, right? Because without these videos, Chauvin would still be an officer.
What was the first release after George Floyd's death? That George Floyd died of medical complications. Okay, and then when the video went viral, they had to back up and clean it up and say it was under investigation. And
but
we had the video as well.
We should also recognize that it puts people at risk because we saw how other people tried to intervene and were told, police are now saying to them, turn off the camera. So there's it gives us more information, but it also puts people who are taking being brave enough to try and record this. It also puts them at risk.
17-year-old girl.
Well.
Yeah,
and then the other.
think about this.
Let me bring in
Yeah.
another guest first, Stacy. This is Clifton
Sure.
Collins. He's an attorney, and he's been a regular on this program, bringing a legal analysis and perspective to what's going on. Clinton, thank you for getting on the program. You had trouble getting in, I understand that. But the verdict is in. What's your impression, and what's next?
Well, what next? Right now, they're arguing over whether or not she should be sent to jail immediately
So
or released
pull
on
back
bail.
from the camera so we can see a little
Pardon
bit.
me?
There we go. Yeah, there we go. Go ahead.
Did
Now.
you hear me?
Yeah, and we see
Yeah.
you now too. Go ahead.
So right now, they're discussing whether or not she should be released on her own recognizance, basically, meaning that they'll just let her go and then bring her back for sentencing, or if she should be sent into custody right away. And
Is that likely to happen? Can that happen? Really?
well, it happened with Derek Chauvin. Once he was found guilty, he went off to jail. But I think in her case, it could go either way. I mean, she has not had any previous run-ins with the law, unlike Chauvin, who had a history of being a thumper, and she does have ties to the community. I think there's got to be some bail, but I don't see it being hundreds of thousands of dollars. But I think there will be bail, and she will be released pending sentencing upon meeting the bail. Again, I would venture a guess 25, 50, 100,000. It won't be $1 million, but I don't think that they're just going to let her go without some assurance that she's going to appear for sentencing, which is what bail is supposed to do.
Who handles the?
And then after that, there's the sentencing coming up in, I guess, January, from what I heard on television. And then there will be the appeals, at least on the defense side. And the defense, I'm sure, will move for her to be not jailed pending appeal. And again, I think it's too early to say. I haven't been following this case closely enough, but I think, again, there's a chance that she would be released pending appeal. But again, she'd have to meet a substantial bail.
Taken into custody. The convictions here are for manslaughter.
Who's talking now? That's the
second degree.
That's the state attorney.
Based on the
okay.
death of Dante Wright, a young man. In other words, it's a case that involves a death. They are very serious charges. It is customary for defendants to be taken into custody upon a guilty verdicts for those level of crimes. And we don't think this case should be any differently. Your Honor, we also have learned that the defendant is not living in the state. I don't know if that was known and provided for in the original conditions of release, but presents.
She's violated the terms of release already.
Well, they didn't say it was put in as part of the term. They assumed.
Okay.
Into custody and withdraw any bail or conditions of release. Your Honor, we do have the Blakely issue to resolve, and we would be asking some direction from the court on whether we should submit written arguments or proposed findings, or how the court exactly wants to address that. We could have those findings, of course, for the actual sentencing hearing.
Good for him.
PSI as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll have a question for Mr. Collins if you have a second when we're done with this.
Yeah, you can pull the screen down, AZ. We'll come back to it in a second.
Many times.
Yeah, go ahead.
Clinton. Question. This for the Derek Chauvin trial and now for Kim Porter's trial, a level of firepower had to be brought in to try these folks. The state had to step in. Like the A team had to come in to be able to have these folks convicted. And when these things really should be charged, the counties should be in charge, but they are proving to be completely incapable of handling such cases when they should be, when it's involving our people. I mean, is this going to be just how we go? If we need some justice?
With all due respect, I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think one thing, the county attorney has to deal with these police officers.
Okay.
Be realistic. Having been a former prosecutor myself, if you work with the cops on a regular basis, not that you shouldn't prosecute them, but there's a real cost. And I think in a matter like this, I think it was entirely appropriate for the to be handled the way it was, because you want to make sure there's not any appearance of bias. And I also think that it makes the success of the defense on appeal much weaker.
Much weaker. Okay. Yeah, but then also there is also the question, even when they are trying to try them, for example, like with this case, well, and then an allegation that the Washington county attorney who was going to handle this was a little bit the charges he had was planning to bring initially were not the same that the state ended up bringing.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, charging is a legal as well as a political decision. And when you're charging, and I've gone through these discussions as a prosecutor, you think to yourself, what can I prevail on? Because the burden of proof in a criminal case is much higher than in a civil case. When I was in law school, we used to have T-shirts that on the front had the various levels of burden of proof. Beyond a preponderance of the evidence, and then beyond a reasonable doubt. And on the back of the T-shirt, it would say, be sure, be real sure, be damn sure. And when you are prosecuting a criminal case, because you're looking at people going to jail, perhaps for the rest of their lives, and fortunately not in Minnesota, they might even be facing the death penalty. You want to make sure that you have enough evidence so that you don't end up with a mistrial or you get an acquittal. Now, if you do get a mistrial, you can always try to try the case again, but then the cat's out of the bag. Everybody knows what your evidence is and your approach. So you want to make sure that the first time is your best shot. And so when you look at how things are charged and why, you always have to have that in the back of your mind. As I've said, in a civil lawsuit, which is what I do now, the preponderance of the evidence is a very low burden. It means that you just have to show that the evidence shifts one way or another. But beyond reasonable doubt is as I've said, it's like you got to be pretty damn sure. And
So
you
does
don't
this
want the
mean that-
jury to have to fiddle around in the deliberation room trying to parse your case. You want your case to be so strong that after they deliberate, they're going to go your way.
Irma, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask the question of Mr. Collins, which is, does this mean that if county judges, are these elected officials? And if so, does this mean that we need to pay more attention to who's being elected to these offices? I mean, I don't know that people pay much attention to judges, in the same way that they do for some of the other political positions. And so I wonder if that's something that, as we think about moving forward, that we have to do a better job of educating people as media folks about.
Well, I think what'll happen is that as more of these cases are prosecuted, the county attorneys are going to learn. They're going to pick up on techniques that they've seen used by the state attorneys at the state level. And your specific question is, county attorneys are elected. Judges in Minnesota are not, well, yes and no. Judges go through retention elections. They can be challenged. But historically, judges are rarely defeated at the ballot.
Clinton, let me jump in for a second.
Just
Clinton,
kind of go through.
Clinton, hold a second.
Motions.
I wanted to get Stacy to say a word before you leave. Stacy has to break away. Stacy, thank you. And again, our complete appreciation for the work of the Black Press of America, NNPA, and Black Press USA. We're streaming live. Thank you, Stacy. But you have to go in a minute. Any final questions or thoughts that you wanted to share on behalf of the Black Press of America?
Yeah, and I wanted to absolutely thank you and this panel. This has been fantastic, and to get the insights of these enlightened individuals that you have on the show. I wanted to go back to Dr. Irma. Just we were talking about the videos. Dr. Irma and the panel. Look, doesn't this tell us that what was really going on, even when we didn't have all of the videos, when we didn't have all the cameras, and yet we still get these cases with the cameras. It tells us a lot, in my view, yes, that it was definitely going on a whole lot more. It's still going on a lot, and the cameras are not a deterrent for everyone. So some sort of criminal justice reform at the police level, at the prosecutor's level, and as you've been speaking of, even at the judgeship level, is definitely needed in this country, particularly
And I can,
as it
yeah.
pertains to African Americans.
And I can say, as someone who's been an expert witness for an implicit bias case in which an African American man was stopped for a DUI. He tested negative on the breathalyzer. They kept administering it more than one time. The guy kept saying, "I'm tired. I just came from work. I've worked a double shift." And what I observed in the video cam is that they had multiple people talking to him at the same time. And then when he didn't follow the instruction, they accused him of being impaired. Well, they couldn't prove that, but they took him to jail anyway. And when they ran his record and found that he had a previous record, not for anything major, but he had been, which 60 to 70% of many Black men have been incarcerated. You got some kind of record. It almost became, a fait accompli. They've got to now prove it. What we observed in the video is that when they tested him again they decided that he had to have had some kind of designer drug that would not permit them to be able to assess it. So they brought in a man to then interpret and to look at behavior, not at the actual data, which kept saying there's nothing there. And what we see is that suddenly they lose the volume, the audio to the video, because there's a private conversation going on. So even when we have those kinds of technology, they can be manipulated. We've seen where people only release a clip and not the whole thing. We've seen officers say, "Oh, my body cam went off," right at the critical moment, and so it's like we have to do better. Yes, we need to rely upon these things, but I think we also need to make people aware that voting for a county judge and some of these other things are just as important, and that we have to remain vigilant. I think your point is well taken. We have to remain vigilant. This is not just because we've had a few successes does not mean that the war is won. We're still in battle.
If you look at
I got I'm sorry, just one last thing, gentlemen. I got a statement from Ben Crump. If you don't mind, I'll read it right quick.
Ahead. Yeah.
This is from civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, just texted now. The family of Dante Wright is relieved that the justice system has provided some measure of accountability for the senseless death of their son, brother, father, and friend, from the unnecessary and overreaching tragic traffic stop to the shooting that took his life. That day will remain a traumatic one for his family, and yet another example for America of why we desperately need change in policing, training, and protocols. Ben Crump goes on to say, if we are ever going to restore the confidence of Black and marginalized Americans in law enforcement, we need to have accountability and a commitment to listening and to creating meaningful change. We must now turn our attention to ensuring that Kim Potter receives the strongest and most just sentence possible. It is also imperative that we focus on the conduct of Brooklyn Center and pinpoint its systemic failures that contributed to Dante's unlawful death. That was from attorney Ben Crump.
Two things, Al.
Go ahead, Jeff.
What we're learning is that the behavior hasn't changed, but the technology has. And in the case of Derek Chauvin appearing to be on a coffee break, and the director of training for the Brooklyn Park Police Department, if anybody in that department would know the difference between a taser and a gun with live ammunition, you'd hope it would be the director of training. The other reality in the Rittenhouse case in Wisconsin is that some people believe what they see and hear, and other people only see and hear what they believe. And frequently they get on juries. So Clifton Collins was right. The ball is in the hands of the prosecutor, and they have to present an irrefutable case in order to obtain a conviction, because even with video, even with witnesses, even with a crowd of bystanders being present when an injustice takes place, we've seen people walk. And these were the first three cases, George Floyd, Muhammad Noor, and Kim Potter, of a police officer being convicted of the death of a Black man in the state of Minnesota. So
The question for me, Youssef, becomes what's going to happen in the civil arena. We've watched these escalating payouts by the city. Number one, I think when Philando Castile and Jamar Clark were killed by police officers,
sure,
the settlements to families probably ranged under $3 million. I think Philando Castile was $3 million or so.
yeah.
And I think Jamar Clark might have been less than $1 million.
After they originally offered $24,000 to the family.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so then the whole game changed after Muhammad Noor shot and killed. Stacy, thank you for being here. Appreciate you
Thank
being
you
here.
all.
Oh, you got to leave. But the game changed when they elevated the value of a human life. That human life being the white woman, Christine Diamond, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, who was killed by the African American, the Somali police officer, the black man, Muhammad Noor. That settlement, $20 million. After that, then you have George Floyd. And I
33
think
million.
but the stage was set. And the question in the community was, there's no way you cannot value George Floyd's life at the same level, meaning they used the term transformational settlement. You can't not do that for George Floyd if you've done it for the white woman who was killed by a black officer. So the question is, does that logic apply still? And
Well,
what does it mean for Brooklyn Center?
It calls into question the issue of qualified immunity for members of law enforcement, number one. Number two, I'm glad I don't live in Brooklyn Center because the taxes are going to go through the roof when they settle this one. And I think while it forgive the pun, fires a shot across the bow of people in the law enforcement community that they can, not necessarily will, but can be held accountable for their actions while on duty. I really think we need to apply legislative pressure on this entire issue of qualified immunity. And maybe if law enforcement employees are required to pay for qualified immunity themselves, they'll have better judgment when it comes to taking a life or unnecessary excessive force or police brutality.
Clinton, I'm glad you're back. I was asking what's the next step, and I meant that in the context of the settlements. What's likely to happen in the civil case associated with this? We're seeing your ear. You must have your ear to your phone.
Yeah,
not seeing
because
your face,
I
but
was just
go
trying to
ahead.
make sure I heard you.
Yeah.
Basically, what's got to happen is it's got to be a substantial settlement because now there's a criminal conviction, and if you are a civil lawyer, this is the exact spot you want to be in. You want to be able to capitalize on the fact that a jury composed of members of the community found her guilty on both counts. So that's going to increase the pressure on Brooklyn Center and on their insurers to pony up a lot of dough.
How much could it be?
Pardon me?
What do you think? How much? What's the realm of settlement?
I'm thinking 20 to 30 million, because what you have to look at is, one, the other settlements that have been reached, and the fact that he was young. He had his life ahead of him. He was 19, 20 years old.
20.
And so the value of a life taken that prematurely, more than likely he would have lived into his 80s. So that just enhances the settlement value of this case even more.
Although I think the main difference, I could be wrong on this, but I think the main difference between like Minneapolis and Brooklyn Center is that Minneapolis, I believe, is self-insured. Okay. And the small cities like Brooklyn Center and where Philando Castile was killed, I think they belong to some kind of insurance pool that manages the insurance claims. So so there's some kind of cap, I believe, 3 million. I don't know. It definitely is not going to, at least from the city's perspective, it won't be that that mega payout of like 20-something million.
The city.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I'd have to do a little research, but I don't think you're entirely accurate on that.
Okay, but I could be wrong. But I remember that being discussed at some other panel I was at before.
Yeah.
The city may have to pay the difference above the cap if that's what is reached.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cap is only on the insurer, not on the city.
And I think Yusuf is more accurate that
Okay,
no matter how you look at it, Brooklyn Center is in for a lot of financial hurt.
for sure.
What about the question, Clinton, of qualified immunity? How does this bring further scrutiny to that practice and that process? And if you would, let us know who's paying for Kim Potter's defense? Is that being paid by some federation, by insurance, by her personal
It's
asset?
probably, I would say, I know in the case of Derek Chauvin, it was played, by the union, and I would imagine that Brooklyn Center is not any different. That likely the police union has a legal defense fund. Now, how it's handled on appeal is a whole different deal. That in the Derek Chauvin case, he was on his own for the appeal, which was part of the reason why he pled guilty to the federal charges. And not to mention the evidence was overwhelming. So I don't know for certain, but my guess would be there is some kind of police union fund that paid for substantially most of her expenses at this level. But where it goes from here, I honestly don't know. It really varies city and by jurisdiction
And what
But
impact on qualified immunity, Clinton?
pardon me?
What impact on qualified immunity?
Clinton's signal is not. AZ, has anything else happened at the actual trial, AZ? Is the proceeding still going on? Oh, let's look at this for a second. Okay. All right. So
Looks like they might be setting up for the press conference, maybe by the Attorney General, most likely.
okay. He's agreed to be on this program either Monday or Tuesday. So we'll have a conversation with Attorney General Keith Ellison either on Monday or on Tuesday to go over this. I'll invite all of you back to be part of that conversation as well. Clinton, Yusuf was asking you to think about or to educate us on how this case and cases like it impact the practice of qualified immunity.
Okay, I thought I responded to that, but I said basically what this case does is it brings more political pressure, but the ultimate pressure is Black and brown people have to vote. That is the ultimate political pressure. And nothing angers me more than people crying about injustice, but don't get off their ass and vote. You can't have it both ways.
And Irma, that's what you're saying.
Absolutely. We cannot take this right that people died for, to be able to vote for granted. And even if you don't agree with all the people who are candidates, we still have a responsibility to do something. And if we don't like who the candidates are, then we need to start getting our own candidates out, there. We've seen the ability of grassroots people, to be able to pull off remarkable elections and stuff. And so, one of my former students is a professor, and she was in the Virginia, state legislature. She mobilized, underserved communities. That was her stance, and she got elected. So it is possible, even if you don't have a political career or deep pockets, it is possible to mobilize communities and people to be able to make some change. And that's what we have to do.
Clinton, speak about, if you would, I'm going to close on this, the historicity of this event. I think history is being made. We're witnessing it in a certain way. What do you think?
Is that directed to me or just everybody?
Well, to you in particular. I mean,
I think, the law is built on precedent. And the more you establish legal precedent, the easier it is to keep going in the right direction. I mean, there was a series of decisions for 20 years before Brown v. the board that culminated in that decision. And the reason why Roe v. Wade has survived as long as it has is because of legal precedent. So the more you get convictions like this, the more you create a game plan for future prosecutors to know, here's what you have to do to put people in the pokey for a long period of time.
Listen, I want to thank all of you for being here. This has been a great conversation. We appreciate it. AZ, why don't we do two things? Take about a minute to monitor if anything is going on the live stream. And if not, let's close with nothing there. Let's close with the music from Ryan. I think it's appropriate for right now. It sets, kind of captures the moment and the spirit. Tom Guitar, Dr. Irma McFarlane, Brother Yusuf Mjini, Attorney Clifton Collins, and also Brother Brown from NNPA. I thank all of you for being here. Thank you for listening and watching. We'll follow this next week with Attorney General Keith Ellison. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Al.
Oh, Queen Justice, where are you? Did they beat you up or no? Lock you on the ground, take the crown away from you?
Oh, Lady Liberty, red, white, and blue. Did they take your dignity with their bigotry? Teach you that you're born to lose.
Free or guilty, it's gonna get filthy. Better believe, roll up your sleeves. It's gonna get rough, it's gonna be tough. We all agree, we've had enough.
We've had enough
of all the rules you break.
We've had enough
of all the money you make.
We've had enough.
No more life at stake.
We've had enough.
This is a proclamation.
It's been 400 years and we're 400 late. Together we stand from state to state. Going back in time won't make America great. We need justice now, people won't wait.
Action, no more distraction. Every step we take, we gain traction. If it can happen to one, it can happen to all. United we stand, divided we fall. Free or guilty, it's gonna get filthy. Better believe, roll up your sleeves. It's gonna get rough, it's gonna be tough. We all agree, we've had enough.
We've had enough
of all the rules you were breaking.
We had enough
of all the money you were making.
We had enough.
No more life gets taken.
We had enough.
This is a proclamation.
Free or guilty,
It's gonna get filthy.
you better believe. Just roll up your sleeves.
It's gonna get rough. It's gonna be tough.
We all agree, we've had enough. We've had enough
Of all the rules you're breaking.
We've had enough.
All the money you're making.
We've had enough.
No more life gets taken.
We've had enough.
This is the proclamation.
We've had enough.
Trayvon Martin and Tommy Rice.
We've had enough.
Michael Brown and Eric gonna pay the price.
We've had enough.
Philando, Breonna, George Floyd.
What? We've had enough.
So many gone. How can we fill the void?
How can we feel?
We had enough. John Crawford, I know you've heard.
We've had enough.
Sandra Bland, come on and take a stand.
We've had enough.
Sean Bell,
Sean Bell.
what the hell?
We've had enough.
Freddie Gray, did you hear what I said?
We've had enough.
This is a proclamation.